Alrighty. Thank you for coming back. And for folks who are not in the room yet, please close the doors quietly because we're going to go ahead and get started with our next talk. So today we have a couple of folks here. Today we've got Jennifer, Meaghan, and Stella. And they're going to be talking about thinking outside the dead box, which sounds ominous, but I'm going to let y'all go for it. So enjoy.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming along today. We are going to take you through a crash course on the methods that Microsoft Incident Response uses to hunt at a scale and pace unlike any other. But first things first, introductions. I am Stella Aghakian. I'm a forensic analyst with a focus on Windows endpoint analysis.
Hi guys, my name's Jennifer Elliott. I'm based out of Melbourne, Australia. I'm also a forensic analyst on Dart, and I have a focus area in cloud workloads.
And hey everyone, kia ora. My name is Meaghan Bradshaw. I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand. Also a forensic analyst with a skill set in the offensive side of the house as well. So to take you through our presentation today, we're dragging you into the wonderful work of Microsoft Incident Response alongside us. We've just had a red button escalation come through, and you're part of the engagement team that's about to respond.
So welcome aboard, everybody. Our customer's just been impacted by a significant ransomware attack. 70% of their infrastructure is down, spanning hundreds of thousands of endpoints. Again, business operations are completely down, and a ransom note has been delivered. Your objective at the end of this 2 weeks is to understand exactly what happened. So you have a very, very short time frame to run through some analytical processes, ask all the questions that you need from the customer, and tell that story. At the end of the day, we are investigators, but we're ultimately storytellers. Collection and analysis are super important, but effective hunting, interpretation of findings, and demonstrating the impact of them is crucial and what is really needed to recover this organization. So you're tasked with taking thousands and thousands of lines of a forensic investigation and summarizing that into 4 key points. That's right, only 4 points. This is known as the executive timeline, and it's going to tell our audience exactly what they need to know to improve their situation for next time. So it's comprised of the left goalpost, which represents the earliest evidence of threat actor activity. The second point is where dominance was established within the environment. The third point is comprised of a summary of tactics, techniques, and procedures that we used throughout the campaign. And the right-hand side, and the last point, represents the right goalpost, so the last known impact of activity and how wide and actions on objectives was felt.
Right, so we're going to get started with something that's fundamental to everything we do, and that's understanding why we're actually there. So why was Microsoft IR engaged? What's our purpose? What are our customers' objectives? And how are we going to meet those objectives to get them back up and running? Defining your overall objectives should always be the first step to any and every incident response investigation, and you always have to make sure that you're defining these objectives with your customer so that you're aligned and you're understanding the customer's asks and needs. That's why communication is always going to be key at the start of the investigation, but also throughout the entire life cycle of responding to an incident to make sure that those objectives have not changed, realign if they have, and monitor progress towards meeting the key objectives so that we're keeping the customer updated through every step. More often than not, one of the objectives we get from a customer is identifying initial access, because customers always want to know how the threat actors got in the first place. The first point on our timeline is meant to encompass the left goalpost, which is just the earliest evidence of threat actor activity. While we don't always identify patient 0 as often as we might all like as analysts, we use this first point to define that initial access. So that can be anything from the initial attack vector and patient 0, if we can find it, to the earliest suspicious sign-in that we see in the logs, Or sometimes it's just going to have to be the oldest activity that we can attribute to a threat actor based on the data that was available to us. Some other objectives that we often get include identifying any persistence mechanisms in the environment, identifying things like data exfiltration, helping them regain positive administrative control over their identity plane, or providing them with security recommendations based on our investigation findings.
Now that you know the objectives that you need to meet, your next step as an investigator is to understand where everything sits that will help you meet those objectives. When we roll into an investigation, our incredible leads and infrastructure specialists work closely with the customer to scope and deploy our customized tooling across massive corporate environments. But that's only part of the picture. If you want to get the fine details, you need to understand the entirety of the environment that you're working in. What are the customer's normal countries of operations? Have they had any previous compromises recently? Do they use a remote access solution, and are they centralizing logs from that solution? Point 2 on our investigative timeline details when dominance was established by the threat actor in the environment, a pivotal moment in understanding that context. The intention here is to illustrate when a compromise shifts from just a lowly user account being under threat actor control through to when significant privilege has been compromised. Think a domain admin or a global admin, signifying the loss of positive control of your organization's identity plane. And asking the customer key questions can help fill in this point super quickly. Does every user have local admin on their corporate device? Are privileged accounts actually separated from user-level accounts? Was dominance established because of a simple configuration error?
The third point we wanted to go through here was hunting wide and then hunting deep. So Microsoft IR will collect data in a very, very rapid pace to jump through and sweep across that data as quickly as we can. We try to identify quick wins in that data set and then pull the thread significantly when we've found something of interest. Hunting wide and diving deep is outlined in point 3 of the timeline, where, again, we're identifying the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were used throughout the campaign. So this might include how far the attack was felt across the board and any persistence mechanisms that were implemented by the threat actor. Additionally, for point 4, the actions on objectives and the overall impact, we also use the hunt wide and then deep methodology to understand why the threat actor was there in the first place. Maybe it was for tenant lockout. Maybe it was for exfiltration of sensitive data. Or in our case, deployment of ransomware.
So once we've established those overarching objectives and goals of the investigation, we understand the customer's environment, that's when we turn our attention to collecting the data that's going to help us answer investigative questions and then meet the customer's objectives. Effective evidence collection is going to be contingent on so many things, but you can't get started unless the data exists in the first place. Therefore, data preparedness is one of the critical parts in making sure the data you need is going to be there when the inevitable security incident strikes. That includes things like going through the cycles of ensuring that key logging events are enabled and that they're being shipped to a centralized logging solution. Additionally, keeping an up-to-date inventory of all assets and updated network diagrams, as those are invaluable to both the customer's day-to-day operations, but they can also help analysts like us who only have a limited amount of time to get to know your environment and then figure out what happened. Data preparedness will go hand in hand with preservation of evidence. So along with having that centralized logging solution, making sure that you have a well-defined retention policy so the logs you're collecting are actually being preserved. Having that SIM with centrally collected and preserved logs can be really, really useful to analysts, and it can also help reduce the time needed for analysis, as analysts are able to draw conclusions and make connections between multiple different events across the various data planes through timeline correlation with those centralized logs. Retention is also going to be key because the scope of the logs available is going to be directly tied to the scope of the incident and attack story that we can actually find and then tell a customer about. That's all great for the preservation piece prior to an incident, but it's also important that preservation is treated just as highly as remediation and recovery during an incident. It's definitely, the knee-jerk reaction to want to burn down all your compromised endpoints, rebuild from clean images as soon as possible. But if you do that before you collect forensic evidence, you're going to impact the amount of that attack story that we can uncover. And then on the other hand, it can also make it more difficult to identify the gaps in security that led to the incident in the first place, and then learn from them, which is what we ultimately want for all of our customers. So, at the core, what we're saying is that you need to act fast, you need to make sure that you're exporting all of your logging prior to an incident, you're isolating and collecting data from compromised endpoints before rebuilding them during an incident, and when it comes to the cloud, making sure that you don't delete cloud resources of interest, because you may never be able to get those back. So as you go through this evidence collection cycle, keeping the preparedness and preservation in mind, there are going to be 3 main categories of data collection for cloud and on-prem that Jen and Meg will take you through. And those 3 categories will be historical, live, and contextual data.
Starting with on-premises, the historical data that we collect boils down to different ways to gather and parse digital forensic artifacts of systems of interest. This historical context helps us as investigators paint the picture of what happened up until that point that we engaged. Triage images include a limited set of forensic artifacts that allow an analyst to get a quick understanding of the state of a machine without having to collect a full forensic disk image. Typically, Microsoft IR relies on this type of collection, where we collect these light images from across the entirety of a corporate environment, then we hunt wide across that data set to identify machines of interest, which will then go and require further collection efforts. Those further collection efforts can sometimes include our next type of image, that full disk image. Collection of disk images is pretty intensive, and analysis is also intensive for the investigators themselves, so we do typically steer away from this, but sometimes it is necessary. When you're dealing with a ransomware attack like our case study, perhaps the only practical way to actually gather data is to just get a heap of images. Maybe you're dealing with a nation-state group that's employing TTPs you haven't seen before, or maybe you've got a threat actor that's trying to cover their tracks, so you're going to have to dive into the dead box forensics weeds. Finally, memory images may also be needed for similar purposes. It's not something we often deal with during our investigations, but when you're chasing sophisticated actors, this may be something that you need to go and consider. And make sure that when you've identified machines of interest and you're getting them isolated, make sure they're not powered off, and don't close off that path that you may need to go down. For live data, the reason that we need this is for the other half of the story. What's happening in the environment after we arrive and engage? Is the attacker still laterally moving or attempting to regain access? Is there an indicator somewhere across the estate that our hunting wide hasn't uncovered yet but needs immediate action? Deploying and giving your investigators access to an EDR solution is imperative to the success of your investigation. Finally, we have contextual data. We spoke a little earlier about how important it is to ask the right contextual questions to understand your environment when you arrive. And this is where you'll take action on those questions. Boundary device logs in particular are often critical for answering the questions that customers want to know the most. How did the threat actor get in, and did any data go out the door?
Now for the cloud side specifically, we all know that there's multiple services, multiple log sources, and multiple portals to get those log sources from. So it can seem like a very overwhelming challenge when you're wanting to have a look into this stuff specifically. We try to boil it down to 3 contexts, focusing in on services in particular. So Microsoft Entra ID, we focus in on sign-in activity, sign-in logs, and the audit logs based out of there as well for any administrative changes within the tenant. For Microsoft Azure specifically, we look into the Azure activity log to make sure we're capturing control plane events against resources in subscriptions. And for any instance-specific events, we're focusing in on the Azure diagnostic logging. Now, there's also one thing to keep in mind here, that some resource types, actually, we can follow a little bit more of an on-prem methodology here, right? So virtual machines, for example, we can retrieve disks and we can retrieve snapshots if we want to dive a little bit deeper into those more traditional hunting techniques as well. And thirdly, if we're thinking about things like Microsoft 365, Office services, so Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, and the like, we make sure to have a look at the unified audit log, which surfaces all the forensic artifacts that we're looking for in there. We'll go a little bit more into detail in a couple of slides. For any live data, obviously we're thinking about the retention period as well for all of these log sources. They differ significantly. So as Stella mentioned earlier, integration into a SIEM or alternative is highly recommended because that's going to solve the problems of, well, centralizing the data into a single pane of glass for one, and also having a consistent retention period for all of this as well. You can use these services as well for near real-time quick wins in your data too. So having a look at SIEMs for operational events, cloud access security brokers for any SaaS applications that you want visibility into, and cloud security posture management services for real-time resource assessment. Contextually, we like to think and can really focus in on identity, of course. We need to consider the identity trust chain for the organization. And what I mean by this is essentially any service that'll issue an access token or grant privilege to the identities within that organization. And that really means that they're inherently trusted together. So things like core and federated identity providers, MFA services, VPN services, single sign-on, that kind of thing. You need to understand the basic flow of auth of an organization so analysts can quickly identify any anomalous sign-in activity around those identities, which it's the modern security perimeter now, so it's super, super important. Outside of that, other services like Exchange, for example, we really want to focus in on the normal mail flow for the organization. A common attack, we've talked about it at length today in numerous other talks, social engineering and business email compromise. Understanding that normal flow of email, you're going to be able to surface behavioral anomalies very quickly, understanding that stuff. So now that we know where the data sits, we'll turn to how we hunt it effectively.
Though data collection differs across cloud and on-prem, as Meg and Jen just went over, hunting will have the same core philosophy regardless of whether you're actually digging into that cloud or on-prem data set. And as Jen was talking through earlier, we approach hunting with a hunt wide, then deep philosophy. So we're going to go over a very condensed version of our hunting cycle. The first step is going to be deep dives, generate leads. Often you'll start off an investigation with at least one known IOC, likely provided by the customer, that you can start digging into. You know, maybe that customer saw an identity doing something suspicious or weird, and that's why they engaged Microsoft IR. An analyst can take that identity, verify the weird that the customer says that they saw, and then deep dive into it to find those additional indicators of compromise, which are going to lead the direction of your hunt. And that will take us to step 2 of the hunting cycle, which is hunt and document, which is that hunt-wide piece. With that, identity that the customer saw, maybe if an analyst is deep diving into it, they observe this identity, log into an endpoint, followed by the download of a malicious binary. You're going to take that malicious binary, and that's going to be the indicator that you hunt wide with across the entire data set to see where else in the customer's environment it shows up. As it says here, documentation is also a critical piece throughout the hunting cycle. It's important to make sure that you're consistently and accurately documenting all of your findings as you're finding them. And on our team, we often say that if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And the reason we go on about that documentation piece so often is because effective documentation is going to be that first step to effective communication with a customer. And then we have the third piece, which is find more leads. So as I said, you'll start off with one indicator, maybe that identity. You deep dive into it, you find something new, such as a malicious binary that's going to lead the direction of your hunt. Then you're going to hunt wide with it. And with hunting wide, you will find additional things that you can deep dive on. So perhaps you hunt wide with that malicious binary, find it on 4 additional endpoints. Those 4 additional endpoints are then the things that you need to deep dive on to find even more leads to hunt wide with. And that's why the final step in our hunting cycle is repeat, because as you can see, you're continuously going through that process of deep dive to find leads that you hunt wide with to find even more things to deep dive on, and you just keep going. With such a cyclical hunting process, something that we're often asked is when we know we're done. There's going to be two key things that are going to have an effect on that process. Because the hunting cycle is not a true positive feedback loop, there's going to be an upper bound on the amount of threat actor activity you can find and the amount of time that you're going to have to work with. Due to those two key constraints, the time and data available, it's important that hunters actually have a strategic methodology and process in mind before they get started. Something like the Alexiou principle, if you're familiar with it, can help give analysts that structure and keep them from falling down unproductive rabbit holes, as it gives you 4 core questions to ask yourself before you get started. Those questions are going to be, what investigative questions are you trying to answer? What data can help you answer those questions? How can you extract that data? And then what does that data mean? What is it actually telling you from a forensic perspective? Asking yourself those questions and having a strategy in place like the Alexiou principle can provide gives analysts a really great method to make sure they have a clear direction and stay on track to meeting the customer's objectives. However, outside of the upper bounds on time and data available, there's going to be other considerations for analysts as well as they go through this hunting cycle. So I will pass it on to Meg to tell you a little bit more about those.
Sweet. So in addition to having that clear direction provided by Stella's hunting cycle, you also have to be aware of a number of common analysis traps and how to avoid these while going through your hunting. First off, there are 2 common biases that we talk through when we're taking our partner teams or our new hires through Microsoft IR's hunting methodology as a whole. That's confirmation bias and observation bias. Confirmation bias is when an analyst only seeks out data or evidence that supports a particular conclusion. When you approach analysis through the lens of confirmation bias, you are bound to miss things because it inherently means that you're excluding evidence that doesn't support that original conclusion. To ensure a holistic view of the data and the attack story as a whole, you must look at every piece of data that you have, no matter whether it supports your conclusion or not. Observation bias, on the other hand, is when an analyst only searches for things where it's easiest to find them. Hunting for quick wins and known IOCs is a great way to start your investigation. But if you only stick to that and you don't employ other hunting strategies, then again, you are bound to miss things. Are you utilizing the correct tools for the task at hand? Are you looking in the right place or the right artifact for the evidence that you're looking for? These are a couple of things that every analyst should keep in mind to avoid the trap of observation bias. Another analysis trap to be aware of is causation versus correlation. Correlation meaning 2 things happened around the same time. Causation meaning that thing A definitively caused thing B. When we're hunting through our customers' data, it's very important that we pull all threads available to confidently determine that something is causation instead of correlation. If we go tell a customer that 2 sets of activity going on where one definitively caused the other, we cannot take that back. If we find out later on that it was actually just correlation, we cannot unring that bell. The ultimate goal overall while hunting is to reduce your uncertainty enough to determine whether something is benign or suspicious. A good quote to keep in mind is that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. This means that just because you don't see something in the data, it does not confirm that that thing didn't happen, which is another trap that our analysts can often fall into. There are a number of things that may have happened. Logs may have rolled. The threat actor may have time-stomped some files or flushed the shim cache. Many things could have occurred that led to that specific indicator not appearing within the data set. Analysts need to ensure that they've exhausted every data source and pulled every thread before saying something did not happen. There are a number of basic compensating strategies that analysts can employ to avoid these traps, such as seeking out and considering contradictory data or evidence, understanding the data sources themselves at their core, including their inherent biases and limitations, and going wider to data sources outside of the norm to enrich your analysis. On Microsoft IR, we will take literally every piece of data a customer can give to us, whether it's the Microsoft security stack or not. And we highly recommend that our hunters use as many artifacts as they can to validate their findings. So now that you're equipped to avoid a number of different analysis traps, You also need to know how to communicate effectively with your customer, which Jen has a great strat for navigating.
Yeah, so one of the most important tools in an analyst toolkit is using a hunting framework, an open source hunting framework like MITRE. Not only can you use it to help fill story gaps overall, you can also use it to guide hunting, because you're normally starting off with an IOC. In our use case, in our scenario, we're obviously looking at a ransomware engagement, so we can place that down in the impact side and work backwards from that. Additionally, when we're talking about communicating with the customer, you're going to have daily syncs with the customer to update them on all of your findings every 24 hours, followed by a full outbrief where you'll be presenting the executive timeline and information around that side of things. Framing these thoughts around MITRE is super important because it allows an executive audience to consume the information and make the best decisions for their organization moving forward. Outside of that, it's also super helpful because MITRE's known throughout the security industry. So you can use MITRE to frame your thoughts, help inform other analysts as well, and enable effective threat intelligence consumption to understand the threat landscape a little bit more across partner organizations.
Right, so we just went over the hunting methodology, and understanding the theory behind it is one piece of the puzzle. But you also need to know how to put it into practice, and there are some really basic context analysis pathways for on-prem and cloud that you can use for this. So on the on-prem side of the world, you have a malicious file or event, for example. Those are the known bads that an analyst already knows about. They're tracking, and they can use that to pivot within the data set to find more of the known bad or surface potentially unknown bads. With the malicious file, for example, some questions you want to ask yourself include if there's an identity that you can tie to the file creation event, how many endpoints it's on, and what those endpoints actually are. Are they domain controllers, servers, workstations, as the impact across the three is going to be vastly different for a customer. Say, if you are hunting, you find it on a workstation, what you can do is try and identify some events of interest, such as when the file was created, if it's an executable, whether it was executed and when it was executed, and then pivot and timeline around those events of interest, and that could lead you to a compromised identity that you're able to tie to that execution event through something like user assist. With identity, it's very important that you understand the context around the identity. That's things like when was it created, is it privileged, what groups is it in an Active Directory, was it always in those groups, or is it possible the threat actor added them? And if it is a privileged account, whether it's synced to the cloud, as that exposes a potential lateral movement path between cloud and on-prem that a threat actor could have abused. Once you understand that context and you have a better idea of what this identity may have been used for, you could follow these context analysis pathways in reverse, maybe track that identity onto a server that the threat actor leveraged it to log into, and then deep dive on that as we talked about with the hunting cycle, and that could help you identify additional indicators, maybe malicious files or events. And you just continue following these context analysis pathways while keeping the considerations around the hunting cycle in mind.
For the cloud side, infrastructure specifically, you're normally seeing it start at the resource level and the subscription level. So looking in the event logs for control plane events, so anything administratively changing with resources specifically, or any data plane events around the consumption of that resource as well. It's also super important to understand the overall topology of that resource. So maybe you've got a virtual machine in one subscription that's been compromised, that's been joined to a virtual network, which is actually in another subscription. It's going to change the scope of the investigation significantly. So making sure we're not tightening the bound to be one subscription and then missing out on everything else. Identity, again, is a super important point of the cloud analysis pathway, and realistically, it's very similar to what Stella had gone through from the on-prem side, but obviously in the context of Microsoft Entra ID. So making sure you're paying attention to sign-in activity for that identity, seeing what's malicious around that. and any audit trails, audit logs to see what might have changed in the tenant or where the threat actor may have pivoted. And just one thing to call out here as well, IP address, so caller IP address associated to events. It's a bit of a gotcha in the cloud. It can't be treated as concrete as what it is on-prem, because there are a lot of services and a lot of events that you'll go through in the cloud that will have a legitimate first-party Microsoft IP associated to them. And again, these are legitimate services, so it can't be treated as an atomic indicator as much. It can be helpful in some cases, but just be cognizant of that. After focusing in on identity, you'll want to move across to Office 365. Microsoft IR pays very close attention to Exchange and SharePoint specifically, because these workloads can hold very sensitive information, as you know. As an example, looking at the unified audit log, there are a few events surfaced that we pay particular close eyes on. For example, for Exchange, we'll look at the mail items accessed event, which might pertain to unauthorized access to a VIP mailbox or something of that nature. And for SharePoint, we'll pay a lot of attention to things like the file downloaded event, where sensitive data may have been exfiltrated from SharePoint directly.
Finally, there is no such thing anymore as an on-premises only or a cloud-only investigation. Modern hybrid environments have evolved over the past few years, and investigators need to do the same, with identity at the core of this change. For a business to function, an identity needs to traverse both on-prem and the cloud. And of course, we recommend that privileged accounts in each of these planes are kept separate, but there will always be cases where that boundary is broken. If a compromise starts in the cloud, you need to understand where authentication flows and how far that reach back extends into the on-prem world, and vice versa. To begin your analysis journey, you can start anywhere on either of these two diagrams, whether it's a compromised resource in Azure or a malicious file creation on a server on-prem. But the most important thing that you need to make sure you're doing is that you're considering both of them in their entirety, not just one half or the other.
So the hunting strategies that are used to analyze this data, that largely remains the same no matter what service you're looking at. Realistically, understanding behaviorally what's normal and what's abnormal throughout those services is going to help you prioritize what hunting strategy you're going to want to use on that data. So Microsoft IR, we use a couple, and we're going to take you through 3 of them right now. So the first one is IOC hunting. So typically, as we've mentioned, a lot of the time we'll start off an engagement with a known bad IOC. This could be something like an atomic indicator, like an IP address, or a file name, or a computed indicator, like a file hash. And we'll essentially throw it across the whole data set, see where it pops, and then dive a little bit deeper into that data too. Utilizing open source tools like VirusTotal, Shodan is super important to build the context on why these might be anomalous for an analyst. And a couple of examples of some of these known bad are LSAS dumps and an info stealer identified on patient 0, the installation of Cobalt Strike across the Windows environment, and in our case study, 70% of the environment encrypted with Lockbit ransomware. In all of these scenarios, an analyst can pretty much immediately look at them and know that they're malicious.
Next up is TTP hunting, utilized to surface common behaviors that threat actors are known to leverage. Whether they're specific to just one threat actor or they represent things commonly seen across many compromises, these are essentially the patterns of adversary actions that demonstrate an actor's preferences. This could include things like directories that an actor likes to stage their tooling in, like perf logs or program data. Perhaps the actor that you're tracking maybe likes to use Go Secrets dump directly on a domain controller instead of extracting the DIT directly. Maybe they like to live off the land with the tooling that they used. Or maybe they bring their own customized versions of malware onto compromised devices. Examples of these on the timeline below include a few things. The first of these being initial access via adversary in the middle phishing. Threat actors are known to use specific open source phishing kits or have infrastructure that can be used to identify this initial access technique. Sign-ins to Office Home are actually a great behavioral indicator for this. Most users don't actually need to visit the Office portal super often, but it's a common landing page used by threat actors to make their campaigns appear more legitimate. Next up, we have ntds.dit extraction from a domain controller. In this case, we don't have a piece of malware identified through an IOC, but rather a legitimate utility, ntds util being used to extract the database directly for exfiltration and cracking offline. Finally, we've got data exfiltration from SharePoint Online. File downloaded events in themselves aren't malicious straight away, but correlating compromised identities, initiating those operations from known threat actor infrastructure confirms this activity to be malicious. Thinking back to our hunting methodology, our ultimate goal while hunting is to reduce our uncertainty enough to decide whether something is benign or suspicious. Though these three events may seem like quick wins, if you understand the adversary that you're hunting, it's always important to make sure that you go through the cycles to 100% deconflict activity with your customer and with other things going on in the environment to confirm for sure that it's not just something benign that happened during the time frame of interest.
The last strategy that we'll go over real quick is anomaly hunting. And we leverage that to identify activity that stands out as abnormal outside of the IOCs and TTPs of a threat actor. Threat actors are always evolving, they're utilizing novel techniques. So if you fail to apply anomaly hunting techniques, it's absolutely possible that you're going to miss something. That's where the observation bias analysis trap that Meg went over ties in, because it's definitely easier to look at the quick wins and the known tactics and techniques that we've seen threat actors use in the past. But in doing so, you are significantly increasing the chances that you're going to miss important pieces of this attack story. But with anomaly hunting, the hope is that you can identify and tie together patterns of abnormal activity to fill in the gaps within your attack story. So obviously, you can't get started unless you know how to find those anomalies. And there's going to be three main kind of techniques that you can use for anomaly hunting. At its core, it's just least frequency of occurrence analysis. So you can use things like baseline comparisons, data reduction, and data stacking techniques. Baseline comparisons against known clean endpoints are a super quick win to pull out those potentially anomalous files, because it helps you focus your data really rapidly and filter out those known good files that are going to match the clean endpoint. That's really important because you can't identify bad unless you first know good. Data reduction, which is really similar to baseline comparisons, can also help those analysts pull out outliers, because it's also going to help you filter out those known goods. Whether you reduce your data through something like a baseline comparison or any other technique underneath that data reduction umbrella, it's really important that analysts keep in mind that what they may assume is inherently good may not necessarily be. A good example of this is signed files. It's a misconception that we often see that analysts will think all signed files are good. That's definitely not true. We all saw that with SolarWinds a couple years ago, where that malicious binary was signed. And in cases like that, anomaly hunting is what's going to be an analyst's superpower to pull out those minor outliers and abnormalities that will indicate something is not quite right. Data stacking is that other technique that you can use to help pull out outliers. Identifying things such as low prevalence metadata across the environment is a really effective way to pull out quick wins. And utilizing least frequency of analysis to identify how common an attribute is across the entire data set, or how many endpoints a given attribute shows up on, is also a really effective way to pull things out that are maybe not as common within a customer's environment. So we have a couple examples on our timeline here. The first one is one instance where we took a compromised identity. We stacked all of the destination IP addresses to see how common each one was for this identity, and pulled one out where the identity had never logged into that endpoint outside of the time frame of threat actor activity. After deconflicting that with a customer, we found out it was a virtual machine in Azure, and deep diving into that VM, we saw that the threat actor had been spinning up and utilizing compute resources to stage tools. In another instance, while Analyzing the Linux estate with baseline comparisons, we were able to pull out a weird-looking ELF binary, send it to one of our reverse engineers, and find out that it was a previously unknown variant of Linux malware. So now that you have the full timeline in front of you, you can actually see that if you had only used one or two of these hunting strategies, you absolutely would have been missing pieces of this attack story. And that's why it's so important, as we've been talking about, that you're employing every single strategy that you have in your analyst toolkit to make sure you have a holistic view of that customer's environment as you start hunting.
So with that, we've made it. You're at the end of your 2 weeks of investigation. You've hunted wide across a massive corporate environment. You've hunted down every IOC, every TTP. You found all the weirdness. You've mapped it back to your original objectives. And you've got your final timeline. The left goalpost, or the earliest evidence of threat actor activity, was due to initial access being obtained via adversary in the middle phishing. A help desk admin got a phishing email, clicked the link, and entered their credentials. Shortly afterward, you identified evidence of an information stealer called Redline installed on their corporate device, as well as evidence of LSAS being dumped to facilitate further credential access.
The next significant point of the timeline happened on day 3, where domain dominance was established. So we saw the threat actor escalate their privileges in Azure to be able to create and modify compute resources, access the disks of a virtual domain controller, and on that, having a look into the Active Directory database and the fact that it had been cracked on-prem, solidifying a full identity compromise.
Next, with hunting wide, you found a myriad of threat actor TTPs that they used to maintain persistence and facilitate the installation of Cobalt Strike in the Windows environment. Through least frequency of occurrence analysis, you found that unknown variant of Linux malware. And then a couple days later, we have Impact with significant volumes of data exfiltration from SharePoint Online, followed by the deployment of Lockbit ransomware via GPO. So after 2 weeks of intensive analysis, looking through the hundreds of thousands of endpoints, data collected from those endpoints across the various data planes that we all went over, dodging Meg's analysis traps and biases, and answering every inevitable question that customers will throw your way, you have a full attack story that's been condensed down to 4 impactful points that a customer's executives can take and then learn from so that they'll be in a better place than they were before Microsoft IR first arrived. So with that, it's all from us. We want to thank you all for being here. And if you do want to learn more about Dart, Microsoft IR, you can visit ag.ms/Microsoft IR blogs.